I'm Pete Peterson, the very grateful Dean of Pepperdine's Graduate School of Public Policy, and really excited to welcome you here to today's conference, Homeless America, Creative and Compassionate Responses to a Cross-Sector Challenge. For those of you who may not be familiar with the Graduate Policy School, this kind of issue really fits directly within our mission in a couple different ways. First off, we are, as a graduate policy school, preparing future leaders not only for the public sector, but also for the nonprofit sector. And as we'll see today with representatives from government and nonprofit leaders and academics and researchers, this really is a cross-sector challenge. Homelessness is an issue that really does require the thoughtful engagement of all of the sectors, from the business sector, nonprofit sector, and government sector. And so we're very much supportive of that approach. This is not simply a public sector or government issue. The second thing is that we are, of the 230 or so graduate policy schools in the country, one of 2 or 3 based at a Christian university. And so we understand uniquely the importance of faith-based organizations and people of faith engaging in public policy issues. And as again we'll see today, the importance of people of faith, whether engaging directly or engaging through faith-based nonprofits, is also an important part of this set of issues related to homelessness as well. Of course, an event like this is not possible without the support of friends. And this is yet another event that's been made possible through a partnership and through support of the Fieldstead and Company Foundation. Their leader is Howard Amundsen, so please join me in thanking Howard in supporting today's event. Howard and his team at Fieldstead have just been great partners in a series of events that we've done that are really focused on issues at the state and local level. Those have gone from urban planning to public safety, and obviously today we'll be exploring the topic of homelessness. A final thing I'll say, as I know that this is an issue that has become quite contentious, maybe because the issues are just so policy-related in one sense, but frankly, these are moral questions in another sense. And one of the things that we stand for, one of the values that we hold dear at the School of Public Policy, is a commitment to what we call viewpoint diversity. It's the idea or practice that all thoughtful opinions really should be welcomed and expressed both inside and outside the classroom. This is particularly important for a School of Public Policy tasked as we are with preparing students that are going to go on and work in the public square. And unfortunately, it's a quality that we see in short supply on a number of college campuses. But today, we are, and intentionally so, welcoming a diverse set of views on approaches, policies related to homelessness, and I am trusting you all to keep these conversations civil, positive, and forward-looking. I know that we have a number of policy makers in the room here as well, and one of the reasons I wanted to do this event here in downtown Los Angeles as opposed to out on our breathtaking campus overlooking the Pacific in Malibu is one, I'm not naive to the irony of hosting a conference like this in Malibu, although we do have issues related to homelessness in Malibu. But I also wanted to make it possible for people working at the city and county level to, whether you're in government or working in the nonprofit sector, to join us for this, because I think it's fair to say that there will be some opinions expressed today, both by our keynotes and as well as our panels, that are unique to the policy conversations that are being had both here in Los Angeles and around the state of California. And so again, looking forward to these civil and diverse discussions. Each one of these panels, as we look at the agenda for today, will incorporate question and answer segments to them. So please be ready to engage with both the keynoters and the panelists. We will begin the program here shortly with Dr. Stephen Eide. We'll then get into our first panel, which is looking at the role of government and the law in response to homelessness. We'll then take a brief break and then begin our second keynote with Michelle Stieb. Have our third keynote following that, which is looking at the role of nonprofits. And then we'll conclude with a reflections panel in which I'll be interviewing Dr. Byron Johnson, who's with us as a visiting faculty member at Pepperdine, and Dr. Robert Marbut. We'll then conclude with a reception out here, and I'm so glad that for those of you who live in this area, you know how much rain that we've had here. As we were planning this event, we dreaded the possibility that we would be doing something where we might run into those issues, but as you can see, it's a beautiful day here in Los Angeles. Also, a last logistics note, if you parked here in the building, we do have tickets that can make it possible for you to park for free, and so either see me or Melissa Espinosa in the corner. And before I get started, I also really want to thank, and I know the panelists and speakers will appreciate this more than most, just the essential role that Melissa Espinosa has played in putting this together as well. So Melissa, thank you. Melissa is our Director of Events at the Policy School, and we have a very busy events calendar, and this has just been really, again, a blessing to work with you, Melissa, so thank you. So let's get underway. Again, our first speaker is going to be Stephen Eide. He's going to speak for about 40 minutes or so, and then there are going to be about 15 or 20 minutes for your questions. I knew that when we were organizing this event and we began these plans back in the fall, that Stephen was going to have to be an essential part of it. I first met Stephen about 4 years ago when he was doing some research for this book that he has out, Homelessness in America, the History and Tragedy of an Intractable Social Problem. And we have just stayed in touch, both meeting out here when he's been doing research and back in New York where he's based. He is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute. And I thought, as I welcome him up, I wanted to quote from a 2018 article, which no doubt was part of his preparation for the book that would come out just a couple years ago. And in this piece in National Affairs magazine, he concludes it with this paragraph, which I think sets a nice foundation for the conversations today. As a constitutional matter, cities are required to tolerate homelessness. As a moral matter, both policymakers and the public must act to address it. The role of political leadership is to affirm, inform, and strengthen the public's intolerance of homelessness, which is a vital resource in the struggle for a solution. Only by viewing homelessness as a public problem, one in which we are all engaged in and affected by, and should be engaged with, is it to be solved, can we truly begin to help those in need on the streets of our cities. Without any further ado, please join me in welcoming up Stephen Eide.
Well, thank you, Dean Peterson, Pepperdine, for asking me out here to speak, and for also putting this group together, just to emphasize the importance of what's going on here. You know, if there is a homelessness policy reform coming to the federal government in particular someday, a number of the participants who would be involved in that effort are going to be participating in this program today. So I say that just to emphasize not just the quality of the program that Pepperdine has put together here, but also the importance of what we're talking about and what we're doing here today. Of course, homelessness is not a problem that you need to convince Californians is important. About 10 years ago, I was working a lot on the pension reform issue at that time, and that research brought me into California a number of times. And when I was dealing with pension reform, you always had to do a little bit of kind of throat clearing to explain to people like why this is important, like we need to do something about this. Since I've been coming out to California to talk to people, research about homelessness, that never happens. Everybody has a lot to say about homelessness. You never had to do much to get it going in the front of everyone's minds. It is a big, growing, spreading, intensifying problem. Homelessness is a problem that is big, it's growing, it's spreading, and intensifying. Its magnitude, California, there are over 120,000 unsheltered homeless people. That's half the nation's total. That's up from about 90,000 in 2018, so close to 40% change since 2018. There are various ways you can measure the magnitude of the homeless problem. Another is in terms of the tonnage of trash generated from encampment cleanups. When the Santa Ana riverbed was cleaned up in Orange County, that generated over 5,000 pounds of hazardous waste that was removed from that site, 14,000 hypodermic needles. And when Echo Park was cleaned up, that was over 700 pounds of hazardous waste. It's a problem that's spreading. We're no longer just talking about downtown LA and San Francisco's Tenderloin. We're talking about Missoula, Montana, Grants Pass, Oregon, and California rural areas like Madera County near Fresno, Nevada and El Dorado counties near Lake Tahoe. These are all examples of places that experience surging homelessness problems of late. And it's intensifying. It was always a serious matter involving injustice, human suffering, but it's taking on this darker cast recently. The LA County Public Health Office puts out every year a report on homeless mortality. And that report found that the mortality rate is increasing. Between 2019 and 2021, the mortality rate is up over 50%. So that means that it's not only the case that more homeless people are dying because there are more homeless people, it's actually the experience has become more dangerous because of fentanyl. The San Diego County DA estimated that the local homeless population down there was 118 times more likely to die of drug overdose than the local non-homeless population. I'm going to devote the bulk of my remarks stepping back somewhat from to take a more distant view. I'm going to talk about the homelessness debate and certain ways in which I find very frustrating about the way policymakers debate the topic of homelessness. My topic that I'm going to devote most of my time to is what I'm calling double standards in homeless policy. Double standards in homeless policy. And what I mean by that is I've noticed in this debate certain ideas that just kind of play differently within the homelessness context versus when we're debating other topics. That's what I mean by double standards. And my four examples of that are root causes, trust the science, lived experience, and perverse incentives. Those are topics that I find, ideas that I see playing differently in homelessness versus in other contexts. To begin to talk about root causes. So, when we talk, the term root causes has a lot of resonance in the criminal justice reform. You hear especially a lot of talk about root causes when you're talking about crime, criminal justice reform. I had occasion for something else I've been working on to spend a lot of time researching a program called mental health courts. Mental health courts, which exist all over the nation, are programs which take an offender, somebody who's been charged with a crime, and he's also been identified as having a serious mental illness. And instead of sort of sending that person through the standard court process, adjudicating, serving through guilt and punishment, they say, okay, we're going to put you in a community treatment program. And if you comply with the terms of that treatment program, you're going to graduate our program and you'll have your charges dismissed, reduced, suspended, sentenced, something like that. Mental health court programs are an example of, there's something called specialized courts, but another term that's used to describe them is a problem-solving court program. Other examples are drug courts, which mental health courts are patterned off of, and something called a community court. These were started in the late 80s, early 90s. And the idea back then was these judges were just overwhelmed by all the defendants coming through their court, all the charges they were having to adjudicate, and they were just really frustrated with this assembly line justice experience. They were trying to design a more meaningful court experience, one with more integrity, particularly for defendants that they could tell had this behavioral health problem that was causing their offending, that was that was the root cause of their offending. I want to get at the root causes of criminal offending. I don't want to just sort of send people through this factory, okay? So that's what happened, and this was a very, very popular idea. Communities all across the nation adopted it. It has had bipartisan support for a very long time. And to come back to homelessness, what I mean by this is this intense focus on root causes that you see in the mental health court context, you don't see as much in the homelessness context, okay? Homelessness policy is defined as mainly people losing their housing and getting them back into housing through some sort of government intervention. There is certainly an awareness that other problems are related to homelessness, but we're focused on the housing piece. We will get to those other problems later. We're not going to be evaluated based upon how we fix those other problems, whether we fix those other problems. It's the housing. The serious people are focused on the housing piece. That is what I would say is the focus of the programs we described as homelessness programs. And what's striking to me is that, so mental health courts, there were only a couple of them in the late 1990s. Now there are close to 500 nationwide. So they spread like wildfire. Throughout the past 20 years, you saw this deepening interest in getting at the root causes of offending amongst seriously mentally ill individuals, and a drawing back from the root causes during the housing first era, during the recent 20 years of homelessness policy. That's very striking. That's what I mean by a double standard. The next example is trust the science. Okay, and I'm sorry when I'm going through this if it sounds like I'm ranting, if I sound like I'm putting up a straw man. I guarantee you that there are people in this room who have also encountered these arguments and have also experienced frustration in the sense that sometimes things are not like quite on the level when you're debating homelessness policy. With regarding trust the science, I mean, I don't want to relitigate COVID. I don't want to go back into the lockdowns. I'm not qualified to do that. Enough has been said. But I think it's understood that if, God forbid, there was another epidemic-like event that rose up anytime soon, and health authorities started issuing directives, those would be greeted with more skepticism than how they were greeted back in 2020. Americans have always had a skepticism towards authority. That skepticism has strengthened in recent years and in many other places, but not as much in homelessness policy. Homelessness policy, there's still too often the sense that this is just about academic research, figuring out what the answers are, and then we just kind of need to get behind them, okay? Even after all that's happened with Housing First, with the campaign to end homelessness, with the sort of disappointment associated with programs like the ballot initiative HHH, the money that was spent, the streets still looking like what they look like, you will still see public officials, and journalists are especially problematic in this respect, still saying that, well, we know how to end homelessness. These researchers have figured it out. We just need to kind of follow what they're saying. The people who are trying to propose alternative solutions, they're knuckle draggers, they're ignoramuses, they're trying to protect their jobs. Maybe they're just bad people. I mean, I remember very vividly a number of years ago when I was speaking to the press secretary at HUD, and I was trying to understand why they're so enthusiastic about Housing First, why transitional housing they just have no interest in. And he said, look, transitional housing, there's no research for it, there's no science. You want to show me a study that supports transitional housing, that's fine. We have the science behind us until you have some science and we're going to stick with what we're doing. There's this phrase that there's an isolated demand for rigor. Like my position, I'm going to subject your position to the most extreme standards of proof, whereas my position, I just know what I'm doing, so different standards apply. I've thought about how to counter this, what to do, because you're essentially trying to move towards a place where you can even have a debate, because things are not on level when somebody says, well, I'm operating from the standpoint of proof, and you're operating from a different, you can't really have a debate, right? You can't talk. There are other studies that have come out, rigorous studies that have said, the decline in veteran homelessness is not because of some genius intervention on the part of the HUD-VASH programs, because there were just fewer veterans. That's why veterans homelessness declines. Also, people who have studies that have come out showing you have to bring multiple units of permanent supportive housing online to reduce the homeless population by one. those studies just haven't been amplified as much, I would say. They've been around for years. I'm not exactly sure what to do to push back on this, but my wish would be that there can't be this presumption that homelessness is just an issue that's going to be kind of like solved in a lab, and we're going to figure out how to do it, and then everyone kind of needs to get in line. Other debates don't work like that. Homelessness shouldn't either. The next example of a double standard is this issue of lived experience. Now, the first thing I would note about lived experience is that this is completely contradictory from the trust the science approach. It's sort of like, how do you want to do this? Like, should we design our programs and our policies based upon convening like focus group panels of current and formerly homeless people, and they'll kind of tell us what to do, or these academic researchers, none of whom have any personal experience to homelessness, published in academic journals, and they'll tell us what to do. Either it's subjective or objective, like just figure out what you want. Suspiciously, these two completely contradictory positions end up in the same direction in a very, I think, frustrating way. And the problem with lived experience, again, it's really this double standard issue where it's like, it seems like only certain types of lived experience actually count. Lived experience for thee, but not for me. For me, but not for thee. Like, for example, like when you talk to people in recovery have all kinds of things to say about their experience. So if you talk to enough of them, you'll hear many people, very common thing to say: without faith, I never would have made it. If I had not become a Christian in my darkest moment, I never would have made it. Hitting rock bottom is what really made the difference for me. That I would be dead if I had not had that experience with incarceration. Another way that I think we ignore lived experience occurred to me when I was visiting the city of Portland last summer. When people in recovery talk about the experience of triggering, like you avoiding person, places, of things that trigger you and remind you of your past condition of addiction, walking around the entire city of Portland is a triggering zone. I mean, you can't go anywhere in the downtown, you can't ride the public transit system you need to just leave town if you want to keep your triggering under control. Families, the lived experience of families with adults with serious mental illness, for example. People with untreated serious mental illness who are on the street, many of them were once housed. They were housed with their families. How did they lose that housing? Well, the families have a lot to say about that. We probably don't incorporate that enough into our policy debate. So it should be obvious from what I'm saying here that you just dismiss lived experience. It goes without saying. Anybody who works in this field has learned vast amounts from talking to former and currently homeless people, talking to people in recovery, talking to families. It goes without saying. And also, we need social science, certainly. We need to use social science to evaluate programs, by all means. But we need to incorporate both, and do so in, I would say, a much more honest way than we're doing so currently. Another example of double standards that I want to go into is the role of incentives, or what's something called perverse incentives. Sometimes when you're debating homelessness, it seems like the other person just doesn't believe in incentives. Incentives just don't matter. In most policy, or many policy contexts, it's all about designing the right incentives. We're trying to fix a solution. We're trying to encourage people to lead better lives. We're trying to improve cities. In homelessness, it just seems to work kind of differently. Coming from New York, where I'm based. Okay, so some of you probably know, New York has a right to shelter. Some jurisdictions have a right to shelter for some populations. They have a right. The state of Massachusetts has a right to shelter for families. Some cities have the right to shelter for single adults, but only when it's really cold. New York City is the only jurisdiction that I'm aware of that has a right to shelter for single adults and families and at all times of the year, and regardless of immigration status, importantly. And New York has had the right to shelter for decades, and there was always this debate about incentives regarding what we called the draw to shelter. Is there some way in which, by offering this benefit in such an unqualified way, is there a way in which we've set a homeless policy to exacerbate the problem, to actually create more homelessness instead of fixing homelessness, that is having the opposite of the intended effect? That's how we went back and forth over many years about perverse incentives at the right to shelter and the draw to shelter issue. And at a certain point, I think progressive advocates were pretty comfortable that they had won that debate, that homelessness is not a choice, Like, how dare you suggest that these vulnerable people are somehow scamming the system? Like, it just doesn't work like this. You don't understand the issue. It doesn't work like that. Until a couple of years ago, New York was hit by what we call the migrant crisis. The migrant crisis. The migrant crisis in New York City began in spring of 2022. Spring 2022, all these large numbers of migrants started showing up in New York City from the southern border. And sorry, what I mean by that term migrant, it means someone who has recently arrived from a foreign country with vague legal status. Okay, so it's, at first they were all called asylum seekers, but then it was not clear if they would qualify for asylum. It also turned out that large numbers of them, most of them hadn't even applied for asylum, so now we could just call them migrants, and that's what that means. Okay, over 180,000 migrants have arrived in New York City since spring of 2022. In 2 years, over 180,000. And it was hard to understand why this is, like, why are they all coming to New York? New York, other cities have had migrant crisis. Why is New York's migrant crisis of the magnitude that it is? Now people are coming from everywhere. I mean, people are coming from Africa, all kinds of countries. But the first wave was Venezuela. There's no little Venezuela in New York, or at least there wasn't in spring 2022. So it wasn't like their cousins were already here and they were kind of like following that path. Why was it, what was happening? Then people said it was the Texas Governor Greg Abbott, but then it turned out actually lots of other organizations were sending them to New York City, and people said they wanted to go to New York City. Why was that? It's a tough town. There's no rental apartments. I mean, New York City has been under a rental emergency since World War II, basically. The vacancy rate for units renting less than $1,100 is 0.4% citywide. The vacancy rate is 1.4%. So it seems like not maybe the best place for you, except New York's right to shelter. It just can't be a coincidence that the city with the most severe migrant crisis is also the city with the most uniquely expansive right to shelter. So this whole debate that people thought was over, was completely flipped. And it turns out incentives do matter. And journalists who in other contexts were like completely dismissive of the right to shelter, like how dare you suggest it, we're just more or less openly acknowledging that, like, yeah, that's why it's so different in New York cities, because New York is like accommodating people. I mean, just to explain the way this works is, so New York has lots of shelter programs, run by nonprofits and so forth, that it's set up for various populations. But when that system gets full, you still have the right to shelter. Somebody shows up today, they have to be sheltered by that night. And so you turn to hotels. And New York has always used hotels. They try to get out of the hotel business. The hotels charge them crazy rates. It's not a good situation, but you have to do it. And so the word got out through like WhatsApp networks, and it just reached the border that if you go to New York City, you get your own hotel room, and which is true. My building my office, where I work, is in Midtown Manhattan on a corner of 45th and Vanderbilt. On the southern end of 45th, on the northern end of northern end of 45th, there's a hotel called the Roosevelt Hotel. Right across the street from my office is the Roosevelt Hotel, the most famous hotel currently in the migrant crisis, because the Roosevelt Hotel, it's this grand old venue. It was built in the 1920s. We used to do events there. Like, I've stayed there. It was like a nice place. Through some weird set of circumstance, the Pakistani government owns it, and it had been shut down during COVID. It was never reopened, and then I was looking out my window one day, and I saw people cleaning out the windows. Oh, that's nice. Roosevelt Hotel's going to open. This was last summer, and then it turned out that the Pakistani government had gotten a contract for $220 million for 3 years to lease this as the migrant intake center / shelter. It's the Roosevelt Hotel. And this is like an old building that's it's kind of being run into the ground. It's a beautiful building, but it's being really not treated very well. The owners had made clear they wanted to sell it and just demolish it at a certain point. But in the meantime, they're getting $220 million to lease it out as a migrant shelter. But this is, just to bring into focus why it matters that incentives matter and why the migrant crisis is a problem. Over $4 billion, that's the price tag since 2 years. That's how much New York City has been spending. That's going up mostly for shelter, but also for things like kids in school. The shelter census in New York City, before the migrant crisis started, had actually been stable. It had been gone down slightly. It was like, by New York standards, sort of under control. It has since doubled. It has doubled. And there's no real kind of normal homelessness policy strategy going on. Traditionally, every mayor in New York City comes out with a homelessness strategic plan. Okay, maybe most of these never come to very much, but at least there's an emphasis on the kind of traditional mix of homelessness problems that most people recognize as homelessness problems. They are doing none of that right now since the migrant crisis. The migrant crisis, we're in triage mode. It's an emergency, even more than homelessness normally is. And so we're not talking about homelessness policy in the normal way we're talking about because of the crowd-out effect and because partly people for so long just ignored the role that incentives play. Incentives are also relevant to this Supreme Court case called Grants Pass v. Johnson. So many of you know there's a Supreme Court case. It's the most important homelessness case in Supreme Court history. There has never been a major Supreme Court case since the modern homelessness crisis began in the early 1980s. It involves this little city called Grants Pass, Oregon. And one thing that happens when these big cases happen is all these people file amicus briefs, these friend of the court briefs, just like shooting their mouth off. I mean, I did this, lots of other people did this. The most interesting one is the shortest one, and it's filed by the Grants Pass Gospel Rescue Mission. The Grants Pass Gospel Rescue Mission is the only shelter in Grants Pass, Oregon, and what they said is that since the local public camping regulations have been not in effect, have been struck down by the courts, that they have experienced a 40% decline in the clients that they're serving every year. So the local shelter said, on record, we have seen this 40% drop-off in the number of people coming into our shelter so that we can help them since the public camping regulations have been struck down. Very striking example of the role of incentives in homelessness policy. So let me move away from this issue of double standards and go into some basically concluding thoughts about the future of homelessness policy, and also there's some ruminations about what a more honest and better homelessness policy debate would look like. I want to talk a little bit about law enforcement and the place and function of law enforcement in homelessness policy. Yesterday, I went to MacArthur Park. MacArthur Park is west of downtown, and there's this silly song written about it from the 1970s. But I took an interest in this place because in a couple trips ago, back in September 2021, I stayed near it and I just took notice of it. At that time, there were something like 60 tents inside MacArthur Park. When I went yesterday, the most striking difference was that the tents were pretty much all gone. There were no tents inside the actual park. There were tents on the sidewalk that you sort of had to navigate. But there weren't it wasn't this experience. I remember when I was there in September 2021, there's a sign right up in the park, no camping in the park, and there were tents everywhere in the park. But there certainly are no tents anymore, but it's still, not a great scene, So you still have all the needles, the public drug use, et cetera. And when this occurred to me, I didn't see any patrol officers around. It occurred to me and I was thinking about this in relation to the Grants Pass case. Okay, so the Grants Pass case, if you're familiar with the details, this is really about public camping regulations, okay, that this little city of Grants Pass tried to put in place and that the Ninth Circuit said were unconstitutional. So the situation in MacArthur Park, there's not really public camping, but it's still not a very, this park is still whole swaths of the park is on the Alvarado street side, you really can't use for most park-like purposes. It's very striking. I didn't realize this till I visited the first time. It's named after General Douglas MacArthur. And there's a statue of General MacArthur just thinking about what General Douglas MacArthur would think. Anyway, but what does this mean? So it's possible. So most people think that that the Supreme Court will side with the city of Grants Pass. Most people think, we don't know, but most people think that the Ninth Circuit's ruling will be struck down and move in the direction of what mainstream Democratic opinion, Governor Newsom, most people sort of are urging the court to do. But where does that lead us? Where does that go? Because if the future looks like MacArthur Park, then there's still a lot of work to do. Law enforcement is going to have a big role in social service type problems in homelessness and mental health and addiction. We're never going to get to a place where those are just problems that are handled by people within the social services, by behavioral health staff, and patrol officers are just not involved. I mean, it's just totally unrealistic. Like, I've studied things like, reforms to crisis response, de-escalation tactics. It's just not practical. We're ever going to get to a sense that, like, when you have mental health emergency calls, like, those will just be handled by, like, social work teams and cops. It's just not, for reasons I can go into, it's not realistic. People are going to keep calling 911. People are going to keep summoning the police. So what is the training? How many police do we want? And the LAPD, since over the last 5 years, their numbers are down 10%, SF, San Francisco PD, about 20% statewide. Sworn patrol officers, it's the lowest since the 1990s, down about 3% since 2018. And by the way, and that's a period since 2018 when law enforcement officers are down, where the beds in homelessness programs have increased by about half. So in effect, we have defunded the police. I mean, the other social services programs have been expanding. Law enforcement has not been expanding. It's been retracting. And these problems, these social service type problems, are very time consuming, Like a mental health emergency call, okay? That could be a job that ties up cops for hours, just de-escalating a mental health emergency call. And CAMET resolution, a labor-intensive effort. That's a historic issue with law enforcement, that the more you want them to do quality of life type problems that the public is asking them to do, again, people are going to keep calling, you need more personnel. So we're going to have to move, I think, to more of what I might call like a guns and butter approach. We're going to need both, and we're going to need to expand the ranks of law enforcement and also figure out the direction we want to give them. But even aside from the direction, we just need more law enforcement personnel. The outcomes are not going to be good without that. Next point in the way of a concluding thought, the role of state versus local government. I know we have some public policy students. Maybe this is a sort of like academic public administration topic, but it seems to me that although homelessness has traditionally been seen as a local issue, states are getting more and more involved. State officials are getting more and more involved. So there were these anti-encampment laws that were passed by the states of Georgia, Missouri, Florida very recently. Governor Newsom is really identified with this problem. People are like looking to him, and he's like, "That's fine. You look to me. I understand." I mean, traditionally it was really a very local problem, and so I just wonder how we're going to restructure accountability questions. So who's accountable? State governments, local governments. Huge problem of accountability in California, especially states. The state, the counties, the cities, the NGOs. Who's in charge? I don't know. And with federal funding, this is a particularly important issue because, as some of you may know, federal homelessness policy flows in a local way. It goes to localities, not to states, but we may need to think about restructuring federal funding for homelessness to better reflect the lead role that states' governments appear to be taking in this formerly local issue. And lastly, the last point that I will wrap up my remarks with, and we can see what you guys want to talk about, is we need to think, I think, more in the case of homelessness policy about who I would describe as the near poor, the working poor, the not quite hardest cases, the vulnerable but not the most vulnerable. This is something that I had to learn when I started working on homelessness policy. I had a mentor who was a real advocate for the seriously mentally ill. And his name was DJ Daffy. He died a couple years ago. And DJ was just relentless in looking at mental health policy and in following all the ways in which the seriously mentally ill always got the short end of the stick. They were always left out. They were always looked over. However much we're doing with mental health, and this is something that I've continued to observe as we're always finding new problems that we describe as mental health, screen addiction, whatever. We need a mental health intervention. Well, when I turned to the homelessness context, that was sort of what I was looking at, but I didn't. And so I overlooked for a long time that, although it's true that people with very severe problems are a big part of homelessness, you could even say a disproportionate part of it, but I started noticing more and more the ways in which our policy solutions for those populations were affecting other populations that were different, that didn't have untreated schizophrenia. So for example, the whole debate over public order standards and transit systems. New York City has a huge problem with subway mayhem. It's just like yesterday, someone was pushed to their death by a total stranger in front of a subway car. Emotionally disturbed. Probably this is not the first time this has happened. Who is most affected by subway disorder, crime and disorder? Well, transit workers, for one thing. The head of the local transit union has been one of the most vocal proponents of more police presence in the subways. And people who have no other options, people who have to take the subway because they have no other way of getting around. This also occurred to me when I was riding the bus in Tucson, Arizona. I don't know how, I know you guys are based here, it's an important thing to ride the bus every so often because you get a look at American society that you're not always aware is present. And in all kinds of cities, that's true. Tucson, Arizona, when I rode the bus there, it was the middle of the day, and it was like the New York subway system. It seemed to be mostly people on fentanyl on the bus, riding the bus, using it as kind of like, I don't know, a daytime shelter, except for a couple old ladies who for some reason were doing their grocery shopping on the bus in Tucson, and the look of misery on their faces was hard to express. So that's an example of the near poor, the working poor who's affected by this. This is what Grants Pass is about. A woman in Grants Pass who I interviewed a couple weeks ago, she got involved in local politics because of the way that the local kids' sports programs, baseball in particular, had been they couldn't keep using the baseball fields in the public parks because they'd been taken over by tents. She didn't have money to start up her own baseball league and start up some private, she didn't have another choice, she had to engage. When we're talking about funding for homelessness programs, particularly at the federal level, and what do we want to fund and call it a homelessness program, we are talking about, and what's wrong with the way we do that now, we're talking especially about cohorts like ex-offenders without serious mental illness and addiction, people who have a shot at a working class existence, who are in the homeless service system. If that's your situation, if that's the kind of program that you want to run, there's really not a lot of public funding to support you, like developing job training programs and stuff like that. People tell you, well, you can go to private charity, maybe you can find something in the justice system, maybe you can find something. It's not a homelessness program. Homelessness programs don't do that. We have other focuses, and that's why those particular service providers have trouble getting the kind of public support that I would say that they would deserve, they would benefit from. The last example of the near poor I want to bring up was I was reading this book recently about mental illness and homelessness in Los Angeles. It's written by this sociologist. It's coming out soon. And this sociologist, spent a lot of time just tagging along with outreach groups from the Department of Mental Health and working with all kinds of vulnerable populations. And he profiled this one woman who was a formerly homeless person, seriously mentally ill, who had a lot of, I guess you would say, anger issues. But she was in a subsidized apartment, so she was like a success story. This woman didn't have housing, she was housed. But she was causing a lot of problems, like with the landlord, with the neighbors. She was really threatening and confrontational, screaming, banging on doors. But then at a certain point, they placed her in a different building. And the outreach team who had been sort of supervising her, they're like, oh, I guess things worked out. People are not complaining like they used to. What happened? The neighbors seem to be getting along great. It turns out that was not what's going on. Her neighbors were illegals. They were this vulnerable population who were stuck because they were trying to stay away from formal public authorities. They didn't want to call the cops. But she was menacing them, and when they found out that this outreach worker might be able to help them, they went to this outreach worker, and they're like, please, you've got to get this woman under control. We're suffering in silence here. And in the column right by the paragraph in this book, I wrote, NIMBY! And at that point, I'm done.
We've got about 15 minutes for questions.
Thank you so much. You're brilliant. It's wonderful listening to you. I live in Venice. You're coming to speak
Oh, great.
tomorrow. Thank you, bless your heart. My biggest question is, in all the research that you've done, and obviously it's expansive, what do you feel is the best counter solution to this push of housing first policy, certainly in Los Angeles? I don't know about the whole country. What shelter system do you feel has the best results? I read a lot of journalists that hate the shelter system, so I feel like it's biased. But I've worked at the Union Rescue Mission, Richard's here, but that's obviously a private shelter, so it can be handled in a different way. What do you feel is the best housing solution to counterbalance the $900,000 a door, permanent supportive housing that doesn't have any plan for that woman who's mentally ill banging around? And so I've been to a lot of Skid Row housing and permanent supportive housing, and it's a nightmare, and they've closed the facilities because they couldn't operate them. So I just was wondering what in your research.
Well, a couple points. I do feel like it's important to defend shelter. Your life is going to be better in a shelter than on the streets. And yes, shelters can be run very badly. All kinds of bad things can happen in shelters, but still, I mean, if the alternative is the streets, like that's not a high bar to clear, and when you can, if you need to talk about like academic research in terms of like victimization, you're going to be safer in like any shelter than on the streets, and we're going to be moving somewhere. It's awkward because it's hard. I've been in many shelters and they're troubling places, but they're not happy places. They're not easy to defend, but it's kind of important to emphasize that they're better than the street and not join in the chorus, not join in the pylon about how bad shelters are. I think that would be helpful. I think that I think a homeless services system in a way is a funny thing. So you might say people are intersecting with various systems. Maybe it would be better if we just had like a larger mental health system, like resources were, like housing resources, were within the mental health system who are aimed at mental health goals. Like that's how we define success. It's not that the goal is housing and then, we'll make stuff available to you and like, if you want to use it, that's fine, but we're going to be a success as long as you're still housed. Because that's how we define success. That's how we evaluate ourselves. I think that other systems, and sometimes we talk about this when we talk about, like federal homelessness policy reform. Like maybe it would be easier to kind of do the things we want to do to help the people in the way that we really wanted to help them, to advance recovery, to advance treatment, advance employment. We should just do it through these other systems. But then that would sort of like abandon the homeless services system and let it keep going with the status quo. So do you want to make those existing homeless programs more like these other systems, or do you just encourage people to like look away from the homeless service system entirely because maybe they can meet their goals of personal transformation easily just outside of a program that has the name homelessness on it? You go ahead, sir.
I agree with your comment that we should be focusing on development of shelters. And I think, the reason for that is as you point out, that the causes of homelessness are unclear, and the ultimate remedies are unclear. But while we may not be able to address those effectively at this point, at least we can focus on getting people off the streets and making their lives a little bit more comfortable through temporary shelters. Seems to me that's where our work ought to be focused.
Yeah, well, that's. Ultimately, it depends on what's happening inside those shelters and what kind of programming is available. But, and I think a lot of governments have actually come to that conclusion, actually. They were resistant to this idea, we can just house our way out of it. And then, very progressives, they realized that, in fact, we want to move back and embrace this model that had been kind of discredited. But I think shelter's reputation is running a little bit higher now than it was like 5-10 years ago. Yes, sir.
So, I'm not gonna stand up so I don't block everybody, but I work in this space, and so I deal with a lot of comments because I post stuff on social media. I'm talking to my neighbors. What do you feel about the power of choice? Because then we're talking about what you just said is you're making decisions, or you're trying to do things to help people in a way that you might see fit, or other people or people at higher levels is doing it. But then when the people that you're trying to serve reject that, and now they go back. And so then now what? Because now my neighbor, just yesterday, he was telling me, well, we just need to throw them all in jail. And you just said, well, the police numbers are down, we need to increase the police around it. But I'm from Kansas City, Missouri, so like when I was a kid, I didn't, increasing the police was bad for me. It wasn't good. I got slammed down at 8. That was the first time. You know what I mean? So then now you're talking about increasing it, but then now we still have to have a power of choice, or are we gonna try to create some centralized standard of living that doesn't apply to everybody? Because right now I have kids, I don't know if you do, but if I just ship my kids off to your house, you would have to get to know my kids before you could feed them, before you could really provide a good life for them, unless you're just gonna say, I'm gonna just give you whatever, and then now that sounds like the foster care system, when those kids age out, and those kids turn around and be back on the streets. So I know it's a multifaceted problem, and I don't expect you to have the answer.
So, yeah, well, let me just talk about, so, yeah, there's a lot there. Yeah, a multifaceted question, yeah. So, but talking about the choice piece and then the police piece. I mean, the choice piece, like, I think about it in terms of your family, like someone in your family. Like, what type of choice would you allow them? Like, you wouldn't just give them absolute choice. Like, you have someone in your family who's dealing with addiction, the first thing you would give them would not be like his own private apartment that he can live in and do whatever in and bring whoever over. So the government solutions are not like, they don't reflect what I think people and their families would want to do. And that's, I think, so that's missing. In terms of the police thing, I think, we just, crime is up, so crime is up. And a larger police presence will help keep safer communities. If we're bringing people out of programs, so out of mental hospitals, out of rehabs, and putting them back into the community, like what type of community is that going to be? I think it needs to be a safer community than the ones we have right now. And then just to underscore the other point I'm saying, people still call the police. Okay, so in New York City, the neighborhoods that have the highest 911 call rates are, yes, minority neighborhoods with a lot of, but people still call the police. So how do we think about that? How do we train police? What type of directions do we want to get? We need to reconcile the fact that we're going to need a larger police presence. I think that's just going to be a fact of life. I don't think we're going to come up with an alternative to that. First of all, I apologize for who was first. So I'm just going to, I have to, you think you were first?
I was, go ahead.
Okay, you go. Sure,
My
ma'am.
question is about homeless policy. I think one aspect that's missing is the public, residents and business owners. Right now, homeless policy is just about the homeless, but in reality, it affects everybody. And I don't think that residents and business owners are really at the table with homeless policy. And I think it'll fail until you get, everybody at the table. Because, secondly, shelters. I think a lot of people think about shelters as big structures with beds, but there are a lot of different options out there that might fit. There's tents, there's large structures in Austin that work, Reno that work. There's sprung structures, there's rooms for tents and tiny homes. So shelters can look different. But then I think some of the words that are used here, like vulnerable, the public's vulnerable also. And again, that's bringing the public into the discussion and making the public, residents, business owners, stakeholders. We're vulnerable also to the unsafe streets, vulnerable to tents on the street, vulnerable to our sidewalks being blocked. And I don't hear a lot about how much money are we going to spend to end homelessness? How much money is enough? What do we say? We have spent enough money on homelessness. This is what you get to solve it. I don't hear that. Is it $100,000 per person? Is it $1 million per person? If we spend $1 million per person, that's mean one person gets housed, 10,000 on the street. I'd like to hear, numbers and where we're going to go. What's our endpoint for homelessness, for spending on homelessness?
Yeah, well, just briefly, because I know we have other questions we're trying to get to on the question of the public. I mean, I do think you have this strange system in California where there's just a way in which the government is just not very responsive. You've got what's registered in the polls, but it seems to be clear what the public says they want, and the policies don't kind of reflect that. And so what's broken about that system? And this is a perfect example of that. Yes, ma'am.
It's a very small question, but it's about a very big thing. Who have you seen nationally address this issue at scale? So I'll give you an image. UCLA has 30,000 students. They have a giant campus. Turkey built out huge refugee shelter camps to take in Syrian migrants. Who's addressing the scale of this problem and providing solutions that match the scale? Because onesie-twosie is not going to get the job done.
And that's what's happening now.
Yeah. Most communities in America don't have a problem at the scale of Los Angeles is. It never got that bad. Once it does get that bad, how do you work at scale to bring it back down to small scale? I don't know of an example of a community who did that. It's just communities who didn't allow it to get. And it's, in general in the social services, behavioral health, like you have lots of little programs that help people, especially people who are motivated to use them. Moving to scale with any pressing social problem is very vexing. Yes, sir, you know you're going to.
Thank you. My name is Jerry Maloneford. I want to draw your attention to the conclusions of your book, because seriously, I disagree with a lot of what you wrote in your book, but your conclusions are right. So talk a little like the shared housing piece and the law enforcement social work collaboration a la cahoots or something, those sort of joint responses, but especially like what your conclusions were at the end of the book.
You seem to understand my book, or remember my book, and I did.
So shared housing is 20% of the solution, and law enforcement matched with social work, mental health is a way to respond in the immediate moment. That's two of the things you said.
Okay, yeah, well, I think law enforcement would help with shelter siting. I think there are always going to be neighborhoods who just have a problem with social housing. You would never be able to eliminate that completely, particularly when you're talking about shelters for like single men. If you could promise stepped up enforcement as part of that package, that should help somewhat. With regard to, but you would need more personnel to do that. With regard to shared housing, it's just a different model of housing. Like there are other ways, and maybe this is what you were getting at, ma'am, that you feel like it's too kind of restricted the choices of housing we have to use. And I think we're going to have a discussion of share housing later on, so I shouldn't humiliate myself by saying something that someone who knows more about it will say. But
Be nice.
yeah. It's the type of housing, the form that I'm familiar with, that you don't necessarily have a lease, okay? You have a house that's run by a nonprofit people are working on a shared problem that they have in common. And they're supporting they're supporting each other with that problem. They're paying but you have to have the authority to send someone away if they have relapsed. If they're not going to be supportive, they're going to have the opposite effect. Like you can't run the program like that. If someone has a lease, it's much more complicated to just send them away from an environment in that same way. This is a perfect example of a program that would benefit not the most vulnerable, because these are people who have made some advancement on the step towards recovery. But but within the mainstream homeless services system, because they would require sobriety, they would not get the kind of taxpayer support that I would like to see them get, at least not through homeless services. So it's an example of more experimentation, more innovation that we probably should be seeing within the homelessness sector. Yes, ma'am.
We have one more.
Speaking of her question on the scale of the numbers in Los Angeles, the Los Angeles County Continuum of Care has 85 cities, 85 municipalities, over 70,000 homeless individuals, right? And over 9 million residents that live in just the that COC. I'm hoping that when we get to the policy-making panel, they talk about that. It's not just the city of LA, it's that massive continuum of care that is shared with 84 other cities that have elected officials, that have decision makers, policy makers, that have a tax base, that don't have a seat at the table, and how it impacts their communities that are outside of the city of LA.
Yeah, just very briefly in response to that point, your system of government is more complicated than in other places. Like even in New York City, we have, because obviously one big problem there is accountability, as I alluded to before. Who do you blame? Well, everyone's blamed, no one's to blame. There's a very good book called Conservatorship by a sociologist named Alex Bernard, which is about a really exhaustive study of the California mental health system. Like mental health in California, particularly as how it serves serious mental ill. You guys remember conservatorship is what Britney Spears was under, and so but it's also a major important concept for help for involuntary care. But it's really just about how no one's in charge in mental health. And it's kind of hard to see how you would get, what do you like, eliminate counties? What do you just, it's very difficult to see how you could develop a more responsive system viewed from that perspective. I think you said we had to stop.
Yes.
Yeah.
Please join me in thanking.